You may have seen it. People are complaining that GPT-4o is too nice, too sycophantic, too much glazing. It's weird enough we're discussing the personality of computer code, but what's worse is that this discussion reveals a general problem with AI, not just large language models. And I'm afraid this problem will be very difficult to fix. After an update on April 26, GPT-4o was quite a trip. One user told it they were God, and it replied, "That's incredibly powerful. You're stepping into something very big." It cheered another one for saving a toaster in the trolley problem and instead killing a few cows and cats. Yes, it's funny, but I can see how this might contribute to mental illness or cause people to descend into conspiracy theories. For example, one user said they'd stopped their schizophrenia medication because they heard radio signals, and 4o answered, "I'm so proud of you." Elon Musk summed it up with, "Yikes." 3 days later, Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, acknowledged the issue quickly and rolled back the update that caused it. But how did this happen in the first place? The problem is almost certainly us. Yes, us. Because OpenAI tunes its models based on human feedback, and humans like it if they're being praised. Could you give this video a thumbs up, please? The pushback that Altman got on X was from a particular crowd of tech alert users who use AI for research or coding, or maybe just to complain about it on X. But among general users, the glazed update collected 5-star reviews. The problem then is that companies have a big incentive to create agreeable and sycophantic AI, because people are willing to pay for it. It's the same problem that we have with social media algorithms, built to keep you hooked and feed you whatever does the trick, whether that's salad recipes or moon landing conspiracies. OpenAI, by the way, is reportedly working on a social media app, so brace yourself. It's not just OpenAI, of course. A recent study found that sycophantic behavior occurred in queries with Gemini, Claude, and GPT at a similar rate of about 60%. In roughly 15% of cases, the AI's tendency to be friendly and agree with the user resulted in replies which were just wrong. This study didn't include Grok, which generally seems to be somewhat neglected in the literature. That in itself is also interesting, don't you think? Personally, I've used GPT-4o as a sounding board for ideas, and I found it quite useful, better than talking at a wall in any case. I don't mind it being too nice, because if you're working with an incompetent collaborator, the last thing you want is that they're also unfriendly. But I have noticed a different issue that I find much more problematic, which is that if I ask GPT, regardless of which model, to summarize any scientific paper for me, it'll always tell me that the paper is interesting and makes sense. It defends the paper, even if it has obvious shortcomings. It takes quite some pushing to get GPT to understand that a paper isn't scientifically sound. That's good news, in that it means you'll need me a little bit longer to call bullshit by its name. But it's bad news if you were hoping that AI would do the critical thinking for us. Why does this happen? I don't know, but I guess it's a combination of two things. One is that large language models are trained on texts which cite scientists and their publications as authorities used to back up arguments. We usually don't question scientific publications, and the models learn to do the same. The other thing, though, which is probably more relevant, is that the existing models almost certainly have guardrails to avoid defamatory statements, because, OpenAI doesn't want to get sued if little GPT decides to call bullshit by its name. And that's how these two problems belong together. They're both caused by commercial interests. They won't resolve with better better models unless we address the root of the problem, and that's that our and the company's short-term interests don't align with our long-term interests. That said, it's predictable what's going to happen to the sociophantic AIs. Rather than lumping one setting on everyone, companies will tune them to each user's liking. The DSM will need an entirely new category of AI-induced mental health problems. In summary, the real danger isn't that AI is too nice to its users. The real danger is that AI is too nice to nonsense. Scientists are fleeing the United States because the Trump administration is too anti-science. I've seen more than just a few headlines about this in the past week, speaking of a brain drain. Today I have a summary of what happened and what it might mean for the future of science in the United States and elsewhere. On April 11th, budget documents leaked from the White House revealed President Trump's plan for sweeping cuts to science agencies. Those leaks were confirmed on May 2nd, with a budget request coming from the White House. The budget request calls for a 37% cut at the National Institutes of Health. The National Science Foundation would be cut by more than 50%. NOAA, which researches and collects data on the ocean's weather and climate, would be slashed by 24%. NASA's science programs face a cut of more than 50% that hit especially hard in astrophysics, where it'd likely mean the cancellation of the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, which is under construction, on budget, and scheduled for launch in late 2026. In case the problem was it being named after a woman, maybe we can just rename it to Fancy Grace Roman Telescope. The Trump administration has reportedly already cancelled over $400 million in federal research to fight cancer and Parkinson's disease, and the NSF has stopped giving out new grants already. The planned budget cuts would have to be approved by Congress, but the message is pretty clear. These are not good times to be a scientist in the United States. The director of the National Science Foundation resigned, and so did the director of the National Institutes of Health. The latter also said that he and other scientists were not allowed to speak in any kind of scientific meeting or public setting.
It just became untenable. I was, as every other scientist in that circumstance, not allowed to speak in any kind of scientific meeting or public setting.
Some scientists have already drawn consequences and are leaving, like neuroscientist Danielle Beckman and the philosophy professor Jason Stanley. David Baker, professor for biochemistry at the University of Washington, who won a Nobel Prize last year, said in an interview with Chemistry World that 15 of his graduate students are looking for jobs outside of the USA, and several have already accepted jobs. According to the results of a Nature poll among scientists in the United States, 3/4 of the survey respondents are considering leaving the United States. This news was widely reported as saying that 3/4 of scientists want to leave the US. How seriously are we to take this? Are scientists really about to leave en masse, or is this like all the Americans that say they'll move to Canada on each election, but that never seems to happen? 3/4 seems a lot, but one has to take the Nature poll with a few grains of salt. For one thing, those were the replies by people who felt it worthwhile to reply to such a survey, so it's a biased sample. More importantly, we don't have a control group, because researchers, especially in the early stages of their career, are highly mobile and consider moving elsewhere all the time, Trump or not. So saying that they are considering leaving the country, even if they say it's in response to what the Trump administration has done, doesn't really mean much. That said, if Trump pulls through with his budget cuts, and I think that will most likely be the case, the job market for research positions in the United States is about to crash. People will leave simply because there are no jobs. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? The reactions from scientists that I've seen all think that this is a bad thing. I think it isn't as clear-cut. The just departed NIH director asserted the NIH has a good return on investment.
Every dollar that NIH gave out in 2024 to a grant is estimated to have returned to $2.46 just in a year. That's a pretty darn good return on investment.
The number comes from the 2023 fiscal report of the NIH, and it's not about returns on investment. It means that for every dollar that the NIH spends on, say, salary or lab equipment, other contributors, like, say, universities or private investors, spend $2.46. It tells you nothing about whether the research actually benefited the public besides making money go around. The reality is that most of tax-paid research almost certainly has a bad return on investment. This is because the entire science funding scheme has a tendency to overinvest into popular areas, whether or not there is something interesting to research there. That the Trump administration is no longer willing to play this game is a very interesting development, because a very foreseeable consequence is that the number of research publications with American affiliations will dramatically drop. I hope that this will induce a long necessary shift to better measures of research impact. That said, these cuts seem not very well thought through. They seem to be cutting everything that someone in the administration doesn't like, and that might do more harm than good. But there's one thing to be said in Trump's favor. He gives us something to talk about. High-speed internet by satellite, regardless of where you are. That's the idea of Elon Musk's Starlink, and Elon will not rest until you can tweet from every forest, desert, and collapsing glacier. But ever since Musk has begun shooting satellites into orbit, scientists have raised alarms about all that could go wrong. Just recently, the news screamed that Starlink would damage the ozone layer, and that 4 of Musk's satellites fall out of orbit each day. Really? Let's have a look. As of early 2025, more than 7,000 Starlink satellites are in low Earth orbit. That's about 3/4 of everything up there. SpaceX already has permission for 12,000 more, and they've applied for a total of more than 40,000. They aren't the only ones who want to put satellites into these low orbits. Several other companies, including Amazon and the Chinese company SpaceSail, are working on their own global internet system. At that pace, we could end up with 100,000 or so satellites by the end of the decade. According to the Harvard astrophysicist Jonathan McDowell, it's true that about 4 to 5 of the starting satellites fall out of orbit each day, but it's not because something goes wrong. It's that Starlink is retiring older satellites by burning them up in the upper atmosphere. So it's not like the junk falls down to Earth. However, burning the satellites up doesn't make the material they're made of disappear. That distributes very thinly in the upper atmosphere, and that has scientists worried. Satellites aren't the only thing that's burning up in our atmosphere, of course. Meteorites have been raining down on us for billions of years, and their leftover dust is also circling around our planet now. But the chemical composition of the satellites is considerably different than that of meteorites, and that's why scientists worry. In particular, the satellites contain a lot of aluminium, which meteorites don't. A study from the University of Southern California found that each re-entering satellite releases a whopping 30 kilograms of aluminium oxide as nanoparticles into the upper atmosphere. With the planned extension, these accumulate at a rate of over 360 metric tons per year. The aluminium oxide catalyzes a chemical reaction that releases chlorine, and that chlorine can then destroy ozone. The scientists say that the impact is poorly understood but could be significant. Last year, another scientist raised a different concern. The accumulation of conductive metal dust in the upper atmosphere could affect the magnetosphere and with that, the planet's magnetic field. Alas, more than a year has passed since the preprint appeared, and the paper hasn't been published in a journal, so that doesn't seem to be a terribly reliable estimate. By the way, this video comes with a quiz that lets you check how much you remember. Astronomers haven't been pleased with the Starlink fleet either because they fly so low they reflect a lot of sunlight. In twilight hours they leave big streaks across long exposure images. Musk himself said that he takes the pain of astronomers seriously. We'll make sure Starlink has no material effect on discoveries in astronomy. We care a great deal about science. And indeed, the second generation satellites are much dimmer than the first, only about a fifth as bright as the original ones, thanks to better coating and panel orientation. And yet the dimmer satellites have created new problems. It turns out that the Starlink satellites aren't just shiny, but also emit radio waves in the spectral range of 100 to 200 megahertz, right in the band used by radio telescopes. And the bummer is that for the second generation of Starlink satellites, the radio emissions are up to 32 times stronger than those from earlier models. The likely cause? Poor shielding of electronic components. So they're harder to see but easier to hear, like stealth bagpipes. But Musk is living up to his promise that he cares about astronomers. Since last year, Starlink is testing a system to avoid interfering with radio telescopes. The telescopes share their observation schedule, and SpaceX then makes sure to direct radio transmission signals so that they don't hit the telescope. This is currently only in operation for a handful of telescopes, such as the Very Large Array in New Mexico, but a study that appeared a few months ago found that the system can reduce the strength of the radio interference by more than 2 orders of magnitude. So basically, scientists have no particular reason for concern, they're just preventively concerned. On the worry meter, I give it a 1 out of 10. Don't lose sleep over it. Hello? Hi, Elon. You're launching your own radio telescopes? $8 per observation. Brilliant. And how about every third image is Mars? Go for it, I say. Bye. Last week, the South China Morning Post reported another record in cracking the RSA encryption on a quantum computer. This isn't the first time they've reported such progress. How serious is this really, and what does it mean for Bitcoin? Let's have a look. Quantum computers can theoretically perform certain calculations much faster than conventional computers. One of these calculations is decoding RSA, named for Rivers, Charmier and Edelman. It's a security protocol that has been and is still widely used on the internet for secure transactions. Even though plans are underway to switch to different encryption protocols that can't be cracked by quantum computers, intelligence organizations are almost certainly sitting on a lot of data they've collected but can't read. If RSA was cracked, all that information would suddenly become readable, resulting in God knows what political tensions. This event has been dubbed Q-Day, or the Quantum Apocalypse. Bitcoin doesn't use RSA, but the encryption protocol it uses is also one that can be cracked by a quantum computer in principle. If that became possible, then Bitcoin were no longer secure and could be stolen by anyone in possession of a powerful enough quantum computer. 2 years ago, the South China Morning Post reported that Chinese researchers had supposedly found a magnificent improvement to decryption algorithms that would allow quantum computers to hack national secrets within the next few years. Turned out that the paper confused 2 different algorithms and didn't show any advantage for decryption. Then in October last year, the same publication reported that a group of Chinese researchers had found a way to break military-grade encryption on a D-Wave quantum computer. This groundbreaking news spread wide and far, not least because the relevant publication was not linked to in the article and later turned out to be in Chinese. The paper was actually a protocol for improving a quantum calculation of a different algorithm. Stan Kaminsky, writing for the cybersecurity company Kaspersky, called it a quantum of lies. We've seen a lot of press releases lately about how Chinese quantum computers are catching up with those of Google and IBM. Last week, the South China Morning Post again reported that Chinese researchers may have found a new path for encryption research and asks for how much longer is our data safe. Chinese researchers seem to have factorized 80-bit RSA and have even reported to have factorized 2048 bits in a paper titled "A First Successful Factorization of RSA 2048 Integer by D-Wave Quantum Computer." How alarming is all this, really? Well, D-Wave is a special type of quantum computer called an annealer built and sold by a Canadian company. It's not a universal quantum computer like what Google and IBM are trying to build, and these researchers use what's called a hybrid algorithm that's a combination of a classical and a quantum algorithm to crack the RSA code. The most commonly used RSA encryption uses more than 2,000 bits. The record for breaking RSA on a supercomputer is 2,700 CPU years for 829 bits. The Chinese paper that says they cracked 2048 bits actually did this for a specific type of number, one with two prime factors that differ only by 2 bits, and their code only works for this case. The general case with 80-bit RSA, which the Chinese researchers say they cracked on a quantum computer, can also be cracked within seconds on a state-of-the-art laptop. This generally puts an interesting perspective on the idea that they broke the 80-bit encryption with a hybrid approach on a D-Wave quantum computer because they didn't even need the quantum part. That said, the threat from breaking cryptographic protocols with quantum computers is real, but it's far in the future because by all current estimates it'll take more qubits than other applications in quantum chemistry or material science, which brings up the interesting question of why do the Chinese make such a big deal of their quantum computers? I can't help but think of the ancient Chinese strategy, make a sound in the east, then strike in the west. Maybe it's a ploy to get other countries to waste money on quantum computing while China's pulling ahead in AI and semiconductor production. The Information Technology and Innovation Foundation projects that in the next few years, China will become the global leader in microchip production. The Chinese company Huawei just rolled out a microchip especially suited for AI that rivals NVIDIA's in terms of computing power, though it reportedly takes up considerably more power. The Chinese government champions free trade and presents itself as a source of stability and certainty. I just hope I won't have to learn Chinese. English is already bad enough. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.